On your screen, that large reddish orange arrow, it represents a land bridge that was discovered in 2009. It's found about 100 feet deep underneath Lake Huron, joining what we know today as Point Clark, Ontario, just 60 kilometers south of us, to Presqu'île, Michigan. The bridge was a ridge, quote, that existed between 10,000 and 7,500 years ago when water levels were much lower. Scientists have found features that they believe to be hunting pits, camps, and stone piles used to attract caribou into drive lanes. Drive lanes are long rows of rocks used by indigenous people to channel caribou into ambushes. This structure is similar to what has been found on Victoria Island. When people attempt land acknowledgements, you often hear those catchphrases like time immemorial and thousands of years. And these are really often largely intangible terms with little context to our modern lives. So today, I wanted to provide a little bit more of that context and bring to life, right from the start of today's presentation, the value of history and the appreciation for the traditional keepers of this land. So, you might be wondering what I'm doing here. My name is Aly Boltman. I'm a researcher and writer based in Owen Sound, and I'm joined remotely today by my friend Dorothy Abbott, as well as a special guest we've brought in to speak to you, William Philipchik from Ottawa, who will be patching you to. And I'm here to shine a little bit of light on the Black history of our region, doing our part during Black History Month and beyond to help address the systemic erasure of historic Black communities in Grey County and beyond, due to the pervasive impacts of systemic racism and colonialism in this country. So you may wonder how I ended up here today, and to be perfectly frank, sometimes so do I. I am a Jewish woman from Toronto who would not be considered Black, and I'm a bit of an odd choice as the presenter for Black History Month, and yet here I am. So I thought I would start at the very beginning to help you kind of understand the journey of how I ended up in this in the hot mic, I guess, and how my lifelong interest of cemeteries have brought me here.
Features of the cemetery, which is that the gate post on the right side is actually shaped a little bit like a tree trunk. And as I wandered about this cemetery, cutting my clothes and my knees, because it really was rough, there were trees down everywhere, I found my way into the back corner, and there was this little gravestone belonging to Myrtle Sloss, who was 6 years old when she died. And here I was, a 15-year-old girl, and I was so moved by this child's stone. And you could tell that whoever had been tending the stone had planted, I think it must have been a forsythia bush or something around it. And the bush had grown so big that the stone was threatening to topple over. And I took all of this with me and was so moved by it, and so was my friend Haley at the time, that we started writing these fire and brimstone letters to the city of Toronto. Here we were, these two, privileged teenage girls living in kind of North York area, and we're writing these fire and brimstone letters like we're preachers. How dare you forget about these people? But it worked, and the next thing we know, we got these letters of apology from the city, and they invited us to come and talk. But the most important piece of it was that the city started maintaining the cemetery again, which was pretty amazing. And of course, at the time that I found this cemetery, I'm 51 now, so I was 15 then. It was long before the era of Ancestry or online genealogists who connected. The only way that you could really get someone's death record and find out anything about them would be to go to the archives. It was quite a process, and I was too young to do all of that then. But now, interestingly, I can look up all of these people. And I, of course, did, in fact, through a genealogist, look up that Myrtle Sloss, who has stayed with me my entire life, to discover that she died of rheumatic fever. Things we're so fortunate to not have to think about now. The Emancipation Festival, and getting to know folks like Dorothy Abbott, who's going to join us a little bit later. I attended the Northern Terminus annual launch at Grey Roots. For those of you who may not be familiar with that, if you are interested in Black history, there is no better way to learn about the local Black history
here than to go to those northern terminus launches and hear the speakers and read the magazines. It's all put together by local historians and scholars, and it's a fantastic way to cemetery. I don't know what happened to that really sweet little gate, but it's gone now. Owen Sound's first cemetery that predated Greenwood was Chalmers Cemetery, and it was at the top of Union Street, which is now 8th Street in Owen Sound. But it was often waterlogged due to an abundance of clay in the soil. So they basically moved everybody from Chalmers Cemetery to different cemeteries. Many of them went to Greenwood, which was originally started in 1858. It was 4.5 acres, or 4 to 5 acres when it started. It's now 45 acres. In 1860, the first known burial happened in Potter's Field. There was a chapel added in 1905 and a mausoleum added just 2 years before the Great Depression. This is the sign or the entrance of Greenwood now. That would be the entrance off of 2nd Avenue East that you would see. You see they replaced the older, original, smaller, white metal entrance with this one. So in 2018, there was a festival in Owen Sound called Lupercalia. It was known as the Lupercalia Winter Multi-Arts Festival. It's kind of a big mouthful that just landed on Lupercalia. And my friend Philly Markowitz was asked to be the artistic director, and she came to me and she said, "Can you do something historic? Can you do something like learning in place, something outdoors, and of course in the middle of winter, and something historic?" So I gave that some thought, and I decided to launch something called 6 at 6. And at 6 o'clock at night, in the middle of winter, it was January, we gathered and we highlighted the histories of 6 overlooked women in Owen Sound's history. And it was a bit nutty because, I mean, who thinks of doing a tour in the middle of winter? You know, the kind of snow it was that awful snow that when you know, it seems really nice and crisp, and then you step on it and you sink a foot. So that was the kind of snow that we were dealing with, and we had about 50, 60 people show up at 6 o'clock, which in winter time is pitch black. And everybody came with flashlights, or they came with candles, lanterns, and we started off here in the mausoleum. This picture looks a little pixelated here, I wish it wasn't, but Brent took this photo, and that's us where we started in the mausoleum, and then we moved around. And I made these poor people walk for an hour and a half in -10 weather throughout the cemetery to go to all different parts.
People were looking for some way to express themselves. And this was a picture of the mayor, the local police chief, and one of the residents and her daughter at the cairn. And as you see, both the mayor and the police chief are taking the knee, because that's one of the things that people did at that point to express their grief and their solidarity. This is another famous picture from that time. This is the former chair of the Owen Sound Emancipation Festival, and he is also taking a knee at the cairn and expressing his own particular grief. And the cairn is a nice, quiet place. You feel at one with nature and yourself, and you can go there and express yourself and just have a quiet moment. These are some members of the Ontario Black History Society who came up on another occasion, and they're just examining the stones around the cairn. But as you can see, it's a place for celebration, it's a place for sorrow, it's a place for getting news, and it is a very much appreciated spot in Owen Sound, Harrison Park. Still in Owen Sound, this is the Old Swan Brewery. The family that owned the brewery, one of their descendants wrote a book, and sorry, I'm just getting ahead of myself. He wrote a book about the brewery, and it included this picture, which happened to be something that some of my family members had a copy of as well, because when they sold this building, a family of Morton Scott, my uncle, bought this building and converted this into their home. Tore down part of this wall, and he created his garden in the back, which he was very well known for his garden. And of course, here's the Potter's Field Memorial that Aly has been presenting to you this afternoon. It's an absolutely beautiful monument. I kudos to all the people that worked on it, because it is just an amazing monument to the people, and it really, really does them proud.
In Ottawa, and the capital, nation's capital, but that you are all gathered and we're speaking about Saugeen Anishinaabe, the territories of the Saugeen Anishinaabe. I'm a non-Indigenous researcher. My ancestors came from Ireland, England, Ukraine, and other places. Many of my ancestors were part of the settlement and dispossession of Saugeen Anishinaabe territory. They actually settled in different parts of Simcoe and Grey counties. What Aly alluded to earlier was the Indigenous people who are buried in the Potter's Field and Owen Sound. I think it's really important to acknowledge a huge portion of the those who are buried in the Potter's Field are indeed Black residents of Owen Sound and other surrounding communities, along with many impoverished whites. I found at least 4 Saugeen people who are buried in the Potter's Field, and Aly would have shown you the table during her presentation. Marguerite Koyea, who was a small child, Elizabeth Kozea, Eldon May Nagwin, and Clarence Yaba. 3 of those names are children, ages 4, 2, and 8, and one of them was a 44-year-old woman. I looked at census records. First, I identified names that I thought could be in Anishinaabe, the language of the Saugeen Anishinaabe, because there are many Saugeen Anishinaabe who may have, names of Scottish or English or other backgrounds, French backgrounds. But I tried to find the ones that were in Anishinaabe, and then I researched the names to try to find them in local census records. For example, Elizabeth Kozaya was listed in the 1901 census in Cape Croker, which is in Bruce County, and then she passed away in 1911 and was buried in the Potter's Field in Owen Sound. So what I tried to look at, and what this in my work, and what the brief research I did with Aly about the Potter's Field points to, is the idea of racial necrogeographies. I promise it's the only made-up academic word I'm going to use in this presentation, but necrogeographies are geographies of the dead. Where the dead are located, how can we find them, how can we respect them, how can we pay homage to them, and most of all, where do they exist on the land? When we talk about racial necrogeographies, we're talking about all the inequalities that exist amongst the dead, right? And that's closely connected to racial violence, which has been prevalent in the history of Grey and Bruce counties. Really, I'll try to be briefer than I've already been. Aly mentioned my PhD research. I have a picture of my thesis there, and a little map that shows a few of at least the driving route from Google Maps between a few of my study areas in Grey County. I'm currently working for Archipel Research and Consulting, which is an Indigenous-owned research firm that I helped co-found, and now I'm a member of. We do historical and social science type research. One of my sites that I focused on in my thesis, which Dorothy mentioned, so I won't go into, is the Old Durham Road Black Pioneer Cemetery. This is one of those stones that Dorothy mentioned of James Washington, who was a man who fled enslavement and lived in Grey County. All of my research focuses on Saugeen Anishinaabe, as I said, which really points to the connectedness of Grey and Bruce counties, because they sort of correspond to the majority of the territory of the Saugeen Anishinaabe, and that's really important to recognize when we're talking about any of the history of this area. 2 of my ancestors, Elias Gray, who's my 3rd grandfather and his wife Mary are buried in that cairn in the middle of the picture there in Dundalk, Ontario, in the Maple Lawn Cemetery. And my ancestor Elias actually named Dundalk after his native Dundalk in Ireland. And I went to the spot where some of his ancestors are buried when I visited Ireland in Dundalk. A white lady from Owen Sound who was given a receipt by the Royal Ontario Museum for Indigenous remains that she and her family had taken from burial places and handed over to the museum. So it's basically a receipt for grave robbing, which is quite grim. And then in the fishing islands, which are right near Southampton, off the coast of Oliphant, the village of Oliphant, there's a article from the Wyerton Echo from 1954, which talks about the robbing of the grave there and how different vacationers and cottagers in the area would come together, and they were all poking at the grave of this Saugeen person who is buried there. So these kinds of things were happening and continue to happen in the area. And it's really important to protect these places, not only because they're an important part of heritage and history, but also because they're very sacred to communities. And obviously this kind of desecration is just completely inappropriate. The fishing islands, which are, as I said, are right near Southampton, are a really important place for the Saugeen and Anishinaabe. And they were leased in 1839 to the Huron Fishing Company, which was a white company, a company of British Canadians, who leased the islands, which were, as I already mentioned, burial grounds, but also a really important source of fish for the Saugeen people. It's really interesting to note, and this is where the connection between white, racism and colonization and Black history and Indigenous peoples in the area kind of comes to the fore. In its report, the Huron Fishing Company stated that the slave states of the southern U.S. are ill supplied with fish from the coasts of Maine and Massachusetts. By a glance at the map, it will be seen how favorable the geographical position of the fishing company's stations are situated to supply Louisiana and Mississippi, with a population of 865,739, including 309,588 slaves, with fish taken from the Saugeen Islands. So this company, even though it ended up failing financially, their whole plan was to dispossess the Saugeen of their islands in order to supply fish, salted fish in barrels, to feed the enslaved populations in the southern U.S. So these kinds of narratives show that, this really important history we have in the Underground Railroad in Canada, and some of that really important history that Dorothy was mentioning and Aly mentioned, is also complicated by the actions of white Canadians who were often economically connected to slavery in the U.S. Canada often had close economic ties, as this account suggests. Also, slavery existed in Canada up until 1833, and that Emancipation Day is celebrating the end of that period. And Chloe Cooley and others were actually people who escaped enslavement in Canada and fled to the United States, right? Especially in the Detroit area, there were many enslaved people from Ontario who took refuge from their masters and supposed owners in the northern United States. Some little brief moments, I won't go on much longer, but some little brief moments in the history of Bruce County. The narrative of refuge in Canada, Black people achieving refuge in Ontario, though very, very important, it also is important to recognize the treatment of Black communities when they arrive here. Boyer Paul, for example, he was a Black resident of Kinloss Township who was elected a reeve quite early in the township's history in 1854. According to a local historian, and I apologize for some of the dated language here, Boyer Paul had Negro blood in his veins. On presenting his certificate of election as reeve of Kinloss at the first meeting, some members took objection to his taking his seat at the council on account of his color. holding that he was non-eligible and expressed curiosity to know if the majority of the electors in Kinloss were colored. After some discussion, he was allowed to take a seat. So eventually he could take his seat, but there was this resistance because how could local whites have elected a black man? And he was deemed ineligible to take that seat for that reason. There was also many different examples throughout Grey and Bruce counties of places where black communities or black families lived. They were often referred to as Darky's Corners, or the word darky became a very prevalent term throughout Grey and Bruce counties to describe places where black residents lived. And oftentimes, local black community members are treated with a lot of hostility. This is a local history called Queen's Bush Tales, written by Robert Comer, and he talks about how there was a local family called the Parkers, who were known as the local N-word family, and there was, he argues that there was no hostile intention in the use of these words, but it was well known in the early 20th century how despicable some of this language was. And he also describes how local white youth would put on white sheets over their heads and go and in the night and bang pots and pans around the house of the Parker family and scare them. At one point they put gunpowder down the chimney of their wood stove, and it caused their wood stove to explode, and they were just extremely tormented, this family. And many black residents throughout Grey and Bruce counties, from the historical record, you see that originally they settled in land areas. Often they weren't able to pay property taxes because of the land, because of the economic difficulties. And once we get past the American Civil War, there's a hardening of Canadian attitudes towards black communities. Many black community members in Bruce and Grey counties no longer became landowners, but in the census they were often living individually or maybe one or two people with a white family, acting as domestics or servants or woodcutters or manual laborers. Sometimes they were squatters who lived in shacks and other improvised dwellings, because the climate in the rural areas of Bruce and Grey counties became very hostile towards black community members, and that's why there is such a flowering of the black communities in Owen Sound and in Collingwood, because many people from the rural areas went and joined the black communities in the late 19th century in Owen Sound and in Collingwood, where they could get jobs, for example, on the ships, as Dorothy mentioned, and other jobs that were easier to get in bigger towns. Now, one of these individuals was a woman by the name of Mary Gant. She was a black resident of Holpoise Bay, which is the little green square in the middle of the peninsula there, right near Wyerton, which itself was an Anishinaabe reserve that was that the Anishinaabe were dispossessed of. She lived there as a domestic worker with a white family. Eventually she came and lived in Southampton, and she became a well-known black resident of Southampton with her children. And so some of this movement into towns took place in Southampton, although the black community in Southampton was not as large as that in Owen Sound or Collingwood. And Mary Gant was a descendant of the Gant, or Gant with an H family. I saw their name on the stone that Dorothy pictured, which I also saw when I went to the Sheffield Park Museum. Me and my wife tried to find the graves of the Gant family, and that's the entrance on the side of a country road in Normandy Township, which I think is part of West Grey or Southgate Townships in Grey County. It's very hard to find, as you can see. There's just a little hole in the trees, Today it's part of a privately owned pine plantation, but there is a fence that was installed, I think in the 1990s, around the two remaining stones. Many of the Gant family stones were essentially bulldozed or discarded. A couple of them remain, as you can see, and it's my hope that this site and a variety of other black graves and Anishinaabe graves can be preserved in the Grey and Bruce County areas. Hopefully, starting with this one, it would be nice if there was a plaque or some kind of recognition of the Gant family's presence in this area. So I'll end it there. I'm not sure